All right, everybody, let's pick up with our part two. We left off with the 1828 election. If you haven't yet checked out the previous video, that talks about the rise of Andrew Jackson after he loses the election of 1824. So be sure to check that out first. But in any case, if you're picking up from where we left off, in 1828, this is when Andrew Jackson wins the election, right? I'm skipping ahead really quickly to look at this map, just because what we see here is a really, really key example of sectionalism, right? Notice how regionally divided this election is. Um, Despite the closeness of the popular, well, it wasn't that close, but it's important for us to realize that the popular vote was closer than the electoral vote, which shows us the significance of the electoral college in this election. And one of the reasons why the popular vote was closer, in case it's not obvious, based on our understanding of the population, right? The New England and Mid Atlantic population was much more densely populated, right? So that's why we're seeing a fairly high popular vote, even though John Quincy Adams has significantly fewer electoral votes, right? But nonetheless, this is the reason why he wins is largely based on things that we talked about in the previous video: the expansion of the electorate, the universal white manhood suffrage that you saw in most states at this point, particularly southern and western states. So in any case, just really briefly touching upon this slide is talking about the coalition of Andrew Jackson, right? The kind of people that tended to rally around and support Andrew Jackson. So, in many ways, they're very similar to the Jeffersonians, right? They were largely rural and agrarian, right? Many of them were small farmers, right? We call those yeomen, Yeoman, farmers, right? The idea that they did not typically, if they owned slaves, there were very few, they owned small plots of land. You could see yeoman farmers as sort of like middle class farmers, right? You do see slave owners as well who rally behind both, of course, as we already know, Thomas Jefferson's presidency and now Andrew Jackson's presidency. So the elite also, if they were the rural slave holding elite, they were much more in favor of Andrew Jackson than they would be John Quincy Adams for president. The political party that forms around Andrew Jackson is called the Democratic Party. And we also sometimes just call them the Jacksonian Democrats, right? Again, they're very, very similar, if not almost identical, to the Jeffersonian Democrats or the Jeffersonian Republicans. We call them both. So in any case, it's very significant to notice the continuity there. But in any case, another thing that we see really stand out with Andrew Jackson's election and his supporters is that you see, in some ways, sort of early examples of populism, right? There were mass rallies and picnics and parades that were held in support of Andrew Jackson when he was running. When he was inaugurated, there was a fear that a mob would descend on Washington, which we can see here, right? King Mob, right? Sort of a play on the idea that his critics thought he was too powerful, hence calling him king, and the idea that the mob, that sort of the unruly populace, right? The sort of the yokels, as it were going to descend on Washington D.C. and create chaos. But nonetheless, going back really quickly, the last thing I wanted to mention from this slide, and then we'll pick up with Rachel Jackson, is that this is also one of the first presidential elections where we see serious smear campaigns going on, or mudslinging, as this slide says. And so, what we mean when we say mudslinging or smear campaigns is that there was a deliberate attack on the presidential candidate's character in addition to their policies, right? This is very common in presidential elections now, right? I mean, one doesn't have to look back any further than the election of 2016, thinking about, I don't even want to go there, but the ways in which all the presidential candidates, right, took jabs at one another's character in one way, shape, or another, right? So this was newer during the 19th century. And one of the major sources of this mudslinging surrounded Andrew Jackson's late wife. Okay, actually, she was still alive during the scandal, but died shortly thereafter. So Rachel Jackson, Andrew Jackson's wife, had actually been married previously to another man. And when she married Andrew Jackson, her divorce was in the works, but it was not finalized. So technically, or legally, Rachel Jackson was still married when she married Andrew Jackson. And so this resulted in an outcry in Washington D.C. People accused her. They called her an adulteress, right? That she was this wanton woman, right? There were many more slanderous accusations thrown around about her character, about Andrew Jackson's character, that he would marry a married woman, and so on and so forth. Rachel Jackson actually became ill and died that year, and Andrew Jackson never forgave his opponents because he argued that all the anxiety that surrounded or that was brought to her from this scandal ended up resulting in her death. So nonetheless, when Andrew Jackson became president, he won. He was victorious, but he became president as a widow, right? So, in a lot of ways, some historians argue that maybe some of his more brash decisions were partially because he was in mourning. He was bitter for his lost wife, and he blamed the death of his wife on his political critics in a lot of ways, or his political opponents. That is. We looked at this map already, so again, just highlighting how this shows us sectionalism, right? This is sort of very clearly north, with the exception of eastern Maine here, but north and northeast versus south and southwest, right? Or south and west, as it were. So, and also urban versus rural in a lot of ways with regard to the way the vote panned out. And we'll see, we're going to really pay attention to election maps from here on out. And I want you to really take note of what you see happening geographically as we get closer to the Civil War. We talked a lot about Jackson's coalition, so I'm really just going to glaze through this. But again, don't forget, it's not just the yeoman farmers that supported Andrew Jackson, but also the planter aristocracy, the people who owned slaves, Westerners, right? People who, did not want the federal government to have a significant role in their lives. So frontiersmen were also large supporters of Andrew Jackson. They thought he was going to be more of a hands-off president, right? And another thing I want to highlight from this slide that is new, that's really important, is the spoils system, right? And so this was new. It's pretty much the norm these days, but this was a new way of choosing one's cabinet that was introduced during Jackson's presidency. And so this harkens back to an old war term, to the victor go the spoils, right? Or the spoils of war, right? So if you think about the spoils of war, I mean, it makes me think way back to Viking times, let's say, right? If you raid a village or a city, for example, and you win, right? You win the siege, then you get the spoils of that siege, right? So, for example, if you were, a Viking raider and you raided, I don't know, London, right? And then you successfully topple down the walls, then you get to take whatever treasures you come across, right? Those are the spoils of war. So you take gold, you take grain, right? You take whatever. So the spoils system refers to that. But in this instance, it's not a war prize, it's an election prize, right? The spoils system, according to Andrew Jackson, allowed him to fire all the previous cabinet members from the previous administration, at least almost all of them, and then hire his own that matched his political opinions better, right? Before the spoils system was introduced, most presidents kept on all the former cabinet members so long as they were competent and so long as they still wanted the job. So, for example, John Quincy Adams kept on most of James Monroe's former cabinet members when he took office in 1825, right? So nonetheless, the spoils system was new, and it was significant in the sense that some people used it to argue that Andrew Jackson was assuming more power by having more control over really switching over the cabinet when he took office. And lastly, immigrants, largely white immigrants from places like Ireland, for example, were also major supporters of Andrew Jackson. And we can talk about why that is as the time comes. In any case, we talked a little bit about this, but again, Andrew Jackson, his faith was invested in what he called the common man, sort of what he saw as the average citizen. The average citizen in his brain was largely that sort of white, rural yeoman farmer. Right? He called them the plain folk, right? You think of folksy people, right? People that are kind of down to earth, don't have many possessions, but work very hard and take pride in the work that they do. In general, he didn't believe that the government should have a major role in their lives. And he was also very anti-establishment. And when we say establishment, I mean economically, right? He wanted to tear down monopolies and trusts that were building up in cities. Things like the British East India Company is an example of a monopoly, right? He wants to tear down some of the American monopolies that were already forming with the rise of industrialization in the United States, right? So in any case, he very much rejected things like banks, right, and big businesses that were largely located in the U.S. at least in places like New England and the mid-Atlantic cities like New York and Philadelphia, right? And he also just believed in the capability, the potential of the common man, right? He, in a lot of ways, was more reminiscent of someone like Jefferson in that way too. We talked a little bit. I mentioned this before, but just important for us to realize that there was a fear among Jackson's opponents, right? They will soon form their own party called the Whigs, right? That Jackson is going to bring the mob to Washington D.C. in the sense that Jackson had a lot of supporters that, at least among his critics, were seen as less civilized, right? Uh, less I don't know, pristine, proper, what have you, right? Less educated, and this did spark a fear among Jackson's opponents that there might be chaos and anarchy in the White House. I'm going to take a break for just a minute, and we'll pick up with the Webster-Hayne debate and the nullification crisis next. Stay tuned, and thanks, guys.